Hello and welcome to Unacademy. I welcome you all to the Hindu analysis. A very, very important day, and most of the articles in the Hindu newspaper itself were related to an event which shook India 20 years back. We'll talk about that. The tsunami which struck India in 2004. A very important event in Indian history and disaster management, and we'll talk about it in quite a lot of detail. So, good morning to all of you. Before we begin, evaluation is a very important process of your preparation. And as I said previously also, the UPSC, which is the Unacademy Civil Services Championship test, is now going to happen on 29th at 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. In a very important aspect here is that for anybody who is preparing for 2025, you can use this test as a form of your evaluation. You can check how good your preparation is. And for anybody who is 2026 and is thinking of joining our organization and family, this is a way to get 90% plus scholarship along with phones, tablets, and even laptops, which will be given out as prizes within the UPSC test itself. So for a 2026 aspirant, it may be a way to enter into the Unacademy family with close to 90% scholarship. And for a 2025 aspirant, it will help you evaluate. More than that, with that evaluation, you also get mobile phones and different forms of prizes in that regard. So I hope that you will use this chance. It is totally free and you can find the link in the description box. So please do use this opportunity. Comes from time to time, but this time it is quite important and very well timed for anybody who is preparing and wants to prepare for 2026. So 29th December, 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. Please do remember this. Good morning. If you want the PDF, I have seen a lot of students commenting that where will I find the PDF? Where will I find the PDF? In my sessions, you'll find the PDF in this Telegram group. Just have to scan this and you'll get access to the PDF of this session itself. So, today we have 4 topics which are interrelated to one another, which is the 20th anniversary of the 2004 tsunami. And the next 3 topics till this point, which is lessons, the issues with the disaster management bill, and the technology related to what we call as tsunami and earthquakes. These 4 give you a very comprehensive understanding of what is a tsunami, what is the concept itself further. Thereafter, we have one topic related to a very interesting bill which has been introduced in Australia. Then 2 topics again interconnected, which is the Ken-Betwa link. This is again a very interesting concept, has a lot of criticism, has a lot of potential also, but we'll discuss that. And last but not the least, a point of defense, you can say cooperation between Saudi Arabia and India. Kuwait and India came together, and Saudi Arabia and India coming together creates that complex even more in a stronger way, in a better way. So we'll talk about all of these things. Now, before I go into anything, there's a lot of static here. I don't know if you've done disaster management or not, but there's a lot of static here. What is the event? What happened in 2004? What were the repercussions of it? Why did it happen? What is the reason it happened in that specific sector? What is a tsunami? What is disaster management? And in India, there was a shot in the arm to disaster management and disaster risk management. After the 2004 tsunami itself, we became extremely serious about this topic. So therefore, what I'll do is, before I go into any of these topics or any of these articles, I'll try to give you the context and in the most comprehensive way possible so that it becomes a revision, and anybody who wants to basically learn what is a tsunami and anything related to disaster management there, you can use the first 10 to 15 minutes of this session as a way of learning about tsunamis, the concept of disaster management, what happened in 2004. You should now expect a question in the examination because 20 years of one of the most disastrous and most affected sectors in the Indian Ocean world, with close to 3 lakh people dead because of it. This is an important event, and therefore the whole newspaper in that regard was dotted by different articles related to it. So we'll talk about that, Shri. Maybe in the end, we can talk about lateral entry. Don't have to worry about that. You can just hang around till the end. I'll take the doubts in the end. Don't worry about that. That will go off topic. That is why I'm asking you to ask me that question in the end, if that works for you. Okay. So what happened on 26th December 2004. On 26 December 2004, India saw in its history, known history after 1900, one of the most disastrous and the largest in magnitude, the tsunami which hit our western coast, our eastern coast rather. The tsunami was of 9.1 magnitude based earthquake of the Sumatran coast, and it is in the Sunda Trench that this earthquake happened. Now, tsunamis principally were known in India, that what is a tsunami, but since we got independence, we had not seen such a big magnitude and such a big event happen in our known history, and therefore when it came to preparedness, when it came to response, we were totally caught off guard. 9.1 magnitude earthquake in the Sumatran coast, underwater in the Sunda Trench, in turn led to a rippling effect, which is basically called a tsunami. I will discuss what is a tsunami also, but the idea is it had such a big rippling effect that it impacted Indonesia, Bangladesh, India, Malaysia, Maldives, Myanmar, Singapore, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. And when it came to its impact, close to 2,27,000 people died in this event, with 1.7 million, 17 lakh people displaced. It is considered to be one of the deadliest tsunamis recorded in history after decolonization. And this is where this event, 26 December, is considered to be a very big, you can say, dark moment in Indian history. More than that, one day after Christmas, it was a very, you can say, it shook the nation. And more than that, we did not have the framework for disaster management. And therefore, this created a cascading effect that today we have early warning systems and we are much better prepared. Now, this is the event. There is a lot of static behind it. For you, some of you may be 20 years old only. It may not have happened when you were alive. The idea is that in the next 10-15 minutes, I want to discuss why did it happen, what are the issues related to it, and why does tsunami early warning systems in a way play a very important role in our larger history today and in our existence today. So if you understand the context, if you understand the event, I would now want to go into a small section of basic static. If everybody's on the same page with me, this is the moment, this is why we have multiple articles today. Yes, sir? Okay. Now, first things first, what is a tsunami? Now, tsunamis are nothing but a disaster which happens because of two events which happen underwater. It could be an earthquake or it could be a volcanic eruption underwater, which in turn would lead to seismic activities, which in turn leads to P, S and surface waves to come through. As we know that earthquakes, it is the surface wave which is the most disastrous. And what happens is it creates an epicenter underwater. When it creates an epicenter underwater, because it is happening underwater, the surface waves don't disperse across the seafloor, but into the water. And therefore, what it does is it creates a rippling effect. And this earthquake which happens or volcanic activity which happens underwater now translates into what is called a tsunami. Now, there is a very interesting concept that in deep ocean, you will never get to know that there's a tsunami coming through. Because in deep ocean, the wave size is very, very low or may not be very different. However, tsunamis mostly catch people off guard because the wave size and the wave height, 10, 50, 20 meters, it only happens near the coast. Because once the depth of water reduces, the energy of the water now translates into a wave. So in deep waters, it will propagate as a wave, but you will never get to know that it's actually a tsunami because the depth of water is absorbing that energy. Once it starts to reach the coast, then it starts to develop what is called as crests and inundations because the energy has to be dispersed somewhere. This is where it is believed that before a tsunami comes, First, the water recedes. And on 26 December morning, it happened. But people were fascinated that why has the water receded to close to 1 kilometer inside into the sea itself. So the whole sea floor for close to 200 to 300 meters till 1 kilometer receded. People were fascinated. But people did not know that is the first warning which the sea and the oceans give to the people that there's a tsunami coming, because that water will be receding because the energy is being absorbed by the ocean. And once it comes near the coast, then it starts to develop and start to take, you can say, 10 to 15, 20, 30 meters of height, which is extremely dangerous. And once they hit the coast itself, it becomes like a wall of water, which thereafter just takes anything and everything in its path. So tsunamis are giant waves caused by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions underwater, and it builds higher and higher in height as the depth of water decreases. Please, you should know this, because there can be a standard question, statement based question, where they can ask you the relationship between tsunami and the coast, or tsunami and the depth of water. The speed of the tsunami depends on the depth rather than the distance from the source of the wave. Tsunami waves may travel as fast as jet planes over deep waters while slowing down near shallow waters. So when they're propagating within the ocean, they can go at 500, 600 kilometers per hour. The wave is going like that. You will never get to know that it's a tsunami, but as soon as they start to hit the coast, they start to slow down, but that energy has to go somewhere. It's all about that kinetic and potential energy to go somewhere. In the water, there is high potential energy, kinetic energy is low. But once it reaches the coast, that potential energy has to go somewhere, and that is where it thereafter translates into kinetic energy, and now you get big waves. So do we understand what is a tsunami? I'll discuss why does it happen and how did it happen that day, but do we understand what is a tsunami? I want everybody's consent here. This is the basic static of disaster management here. Yes, sir. Yes? Okay. Cyclone is very different. Cyclone is based on pressure differences. It is based on upper air circulation, and thereafter cyclone and tsunami. Cyclones can cause tsunami, but it is mostly called a storm surge. But cyclones are totally different. Totally different. Tsunami is a disaster. It is based on seismic activities, and cyclones are based on pressure differences, coriolis effect, multiple things which affected, and it is based on the surface temperature. It is based on the pressure, low pressure in the eye, and thereafter high pressure around it. The surface temperature has to be in a certain space where there is upper air circulation, and that's a separate issue altogether. Mumtaz has nothing to do with tsunamis. Tsunamis, straightforward, are based on seismic and volcanic activities. Underwater, the potential energy has to disperse itself. It becomes kinetic, which in turn becomes a great wall of water. Now, when it happened in the Sunda Trench, this computer simulation gives you the level of energy which was transferred. If you look at this, originating from here, it had a rippling effect, which could be seen even in Antarctica at a given point of time. And this much level of energy, thereafter, when it reached the eastern coast of India, when it reached the Malaysian and the Sumatran islands, it led to instant death and destruction, which was never seen previously in decolonized history, meaning not recorded in the history of this sector after colonization. And this is where this event is considered unprecedented in Asian history, because there was no precedence to it. We as a nation did not know how to respond to it, because we had never seen something like it. Tsunamis were known on paper, people used to discuss it, but nobody knew how to respond to it. Even when we got to know that the Sumatra, and it happened in the early morning stages, that was even more unfortunate. A lot of people died when they were sleeping. They were swept by the water. They did not even get a chance to see the first sun of 26th December. The idea was there was no way, even when Sumatra was hit first, we had no way to respond to it. So for most of India, there was no way to respond to it. And this is where the government of India was also caught off guard. But the question is, why did it happen in this sector? This 9.1 to 9.3 Richter scale earthquake, we knew because an earthquake happens, we have seismic meters. We have seismic meters which tell us that the earthquake happened. But nobody knew that it could translate into this. And this is where you have to understand the plate tectonics. And this is where we are going to pure geography. See, as you know that the Earth's crust and the continents as you see today are nothing but plates which are floating on the, you can say, magma layer of the crust and the mantle. And therefore, there are multiple plates. You have the Indian plate, the Australian plate, you have the Eurasian plate, you have the Pacific plate. And basically these plates in a way are nothing but islands floating on a bed of lava or magma in that regard. Now, when you, for example, you have a bucket of water and you put a small piece of paper on it, and you have 3 to 4 papers on that, you can say, surface of that water, will those piece of paper remain static where you put them, or they'll move around in the water? What is the answer to that question? When you have a certain boat, for example, 3 to 4 boats on water, do they move around or they remain static? They move around. They move. And this means that these plates are also moving, which is called plate tectonics, which is these plates are not static. They are not anchored to the mantle. They are moving on the bed of lava. And therefore, now there can be movement towards each other and there can be movement away from each other, right? There can be one plate which is moving away from each other, which is called a divergent plate. And there could be also one plate which is moving into one another. This is called a convergent plate. So these plates have both type of tendencies, which is they try to come together or they try to move away from one another. When they move away from one another, that is called divergence, and that leads to valleys and trenches being created in the ocean floor or on the earth itself, which is on continent we call it rift valleys. So there's a argument which is being pushed that this rift valley is basically becoming, this is a divergent plate. Both plates are moving from one another. So when they're diverging, there's a certain hypothetical situation, and most probably it will also going to happen, that the Somalian plate is going to shift, and most probably this part of Africa is moving towards the Indian plate. So rift valleys on the surface of the earth and valleys inside the oceans. This is called a divergent. But the more dangerous one is that convergent plate. When there's a convergent plate, what happens is, when two plates meet together, something called subduction happens. Subduction is that if you are going to push two things together, something has to give. So what happens is that one plate now goes under the other plate. This is called subduction. This mostly leads to volcanic activities, but also in turn leads to a lot of seismic activities because two plates are going under each other. So a divergent plate tends to lead to what is called as continental drift. On the other hand, a subduction underneath going one another in turn leads to a lot of volcanic formations and seismic activities. So the reason why we saw in the Sunda Trench this happening was because this sector falls under something called the Pacific Ring of Fire. Now, the Pacific Ring of Fire is the Pacific plate, the Antarctic plate, the Indo-Austrian plate, basically pushing into the Eurasian plate. And if you see something where it makes something like this means convergent and this means divergent, meaning that here along this line there is a divergent plate, meaning they are moving away from one another, and here they are thrusting into one another. So you can see the amount of pressure which is now being applied by this plate on different points. The Sunda Trench is one of those points where there was a convergent, you can say, movement on that given day in 2004, which in turn led to a 9.1 to 9.3 Richter scale earthquake happening, which then translated into a tsunami, which saw the level of water changing, not just in the Indian Ocean, but you can see that till the Latin American sector in the Atlantic and across the coast of Antarctica, there were rippling effects of it. This is the amount of energy it holds. India is just next to the epicenter. But just to give you an understanding that anything around the Pacific Ring of Fire, there is always a vulnerability related to tsunamis and seismic activities. That is why you can see the Japanese basically fall on the ring of fire, and therefore as a country they are always prepared for earthquakes, and that is why their infrastructure and all their early warning systems are based on these seismic activities. So any country along the ring of fire is vulnerable to these concepts. We knew that. However, we had never seen something like this happen in human history, for us at least. And therefore, the reason why the tsunami of 2004 happened was because of the convergence of two plates together, which in turn led to the release of energy in the form of an earthquake, which in turn translated into what today is called as the 2004 tsunami. So what is a tsunami? I hope you understand that. Now you understand why this energy was released, because the plates were converging and therefore a lot of energy was released in the form of an earthquake, which in turn had a rippling effect across the ocean itself. And Sumatra, India, Thailand, and the whole, you can say, countries in and around the Bay of Bengal were vulnerable to this, but there was no framework to understand how to go about it. So I hope you understand the static portion here. Why does it happen? And what is the magnitude it happens? And why do we now need to create a framework? Because we are vulnerable to this. This is where now these articles come through. But again, as I said, I took this 10 to 15 minutes in order to create a certain framework for you to understand things. So we understand the event, we understand the static portion, we understand subduction, we understand convergent, divergent, we understand plate tectonics, also we understand what is called the ring of fire. Do we understand these things? Because if I'm going to use these terms further, we have to first qualify any term we use. So I want everybody's consent here that yes sir, we are on the same page. We understand what is a tsunami, how does it happen, and what is the impact of that. Perfect. So everybody's on the same page. This may have been revision for you if you have already covered disaster management. But do understand now in GS paper 3, 2 and in prelims, this is going to become a very important concept. Approximately how much time it takes for people? See, UPSC, that matters on where the epicenter is, how much is the distance, and on the magnitude. Here it says, see, what does it say? It says that the speed of the tsunami depends on the ocean depth rather than the distance from the source. So it is quite contingent on how deep that ocean was or that sea is. If it is extremely deep, it will take a little bit more time. If it's shallower, it will take, if it's extremely deep, it will travel very quickly. But if it's very shallow, it will travel slowly, but then become more. So it's about depth. So if you get a question in the examination, it will be fully based on depth. Depth of water decides. The more the depth, the faster it will be, because near the coast, it becomes slower. That is where, for anybody who understands potential and kinetic energy, potential energy is when a ball is on the top of a mountain. It has a lot of energy in potential. It is then rolled down. That potential energy becomes kinetic energy, which is movement-based energy. So when it is in deep waters, potential energy keeps on building up. That is why it does not show as big waves in water. That if that would have been the case, then it would automatically mean that there's a tsunami coming. That is why tsunamis cannot be detected in water, because over the surface of the water, when the depth is very high, it doesn't seem like there's a tsunami. It is only when it comes to the coast that the potential energy now starts to convert into kinetic energy, and the water now starts to become much higher than what it was in deep waters. Clear, everyone? UPSC. So it is fully contingent on the depth of water. That can only be decided through a mathematical model when you take into account where you are and where the epicenter is. Right? Okay. Now there were five articles which dealt with this concept. Out of that, 3 were important for UPSC. Meaning 2 were rhetorical, made good topics but not relevant for you as an aspirant. 3 were important, in which one is the lessons learned. The second one is what is called as disaster management bill, and which was introduced in 2005, exactly 1 year after the tsunami itself. And the third one was related to the science and early warning systems. The other 2 were about a story of the city of Nagapattinam and the other one of another city. That was good but irrelevant for your preparation. So as we are doing smart hard work, what matters to us is how do we actually look at the newspaper. So things may be good to read but may not be relevant for you. Out of these 3, we will get a certain framework in which now we can answer about tsunami mitigation, the concept of how do we deal with them, and the other vulnerabilities which are introduced because of tsunamis. So I hope that you understand why am I only covering these 3 and the other 2 I'm not covering, because they are rhetorical. They really don't make sense within your understanding of civil services examination. Okay. The first article deals with the lessons which were given to us or we have learned in the process of these 20 years. Meaning since 2004, in 2024, Pushpendra Kumar, who was a professor in TIS and was also linked to the relief activity which happened across the ASEAN countries and in India, he is coming up with 6 to 7 lessons which were learned in the process of relief, in the process of rehabilitation, in the process of this disaster. Now, before I go into that, what is more difficult? The disaster itself or the relief and the rehabilitation which happens afterwards? What is the answer to that question? It is the disaster itself or what happens thereafter, which is relief, rehabilitation and reconstruction. Which is more difficult for humans as mankind, as humans? What is more difficult for us? What is the answer to this question? Nothing on the screen. Okay. Rehabilitation, relief and rehabilitation. Okay. So we are all on the same page that the disaster may be predicted, but it will happen. It is how we respond to it which is more difficult to manage. And this is a point which will come everywhere, which is if we do not have a disaster relief and management concept, then we are basically waiting for another disaster to happen. The disaster itself is something, but if we are not able to give relief and rehabilitation, if we do not have a framework, it becomes even more problematic. So therefore, what were the lessons learned in the whole process of this disaster? The first, he argues, was the importance of mangrove forests and their anti-tsunami characteristics were exposed and acknowledged. This is a very important point wherein we used to think mangrove forests are part of the larger landscape of the ecosystem in and around. But during the tsunami, we realized that mangrove forests have the potential to take away that kinetic energy and in turn lead to 3 to 4 very interesting effects. First things first, mangrove forests are part of the coastal ecosystem in tropical and subtropical zones. They are salt tolerant trees and shrubs which develop in the intertidal zone, meaning where the tide enters and exits, low and what we call high tide sectors. And they are, in a way, because of their adaptation, very good in developing in saline water, and they manage tidal fluctuations also very well, and in oxygen poor soil also they survive. That is a separate issue altogether. But it is believed that if there is a mangrove forest when a tsunami comes through, there are multiple ways in which it helps. First is called the trapping effect, which is if there are forests before the coast itself, they trap the water and therefore reduce the potential of the water itself. So the speed and the impact of the water is in a way abruptly managed. Second is called the escape factor. If the forests in and around the coasts are mangrove and other tropical forests, if the water height is not more than 20-25 meters, you can also use the trees as a way of escaping the rush of water in that regard. And the third is, it may also be that you are able to absorb. As a person, you may be in a way pushed into a tree, and therefore soft landing effect comes through, that maybe trees will help you hold on to something. It may help you in a way as a shock absorber, very good point, and it allows you to maybe not be thrown into other harder, you can say, material and surfaces, which could in turn lead to you suffocating or drowning. And this is where mangrove forests have a very important role. It is believed that a coastline which does not have mangrove forests can in turn lead to direct damage, meaning if there is 100% damage which can happen because of a tsunami, if there is a forest habitat, if there's a mangrove forest before the coast itself, it allows for that damage to be reduced by 20 to 30, 40%, in some cases 50 to 60%, which in turn allows us to understand that we have to protect our mangroves, which was not being done. Because for coastal shipping, for fishing, for shrimp farms, and for what we call as recreational purposes tourism, India's mangrove forests were indiscriminately destroyed and cut. And from 2004 onwards, there has been a conscious, you can say, policy with 0.15% of the forest only being mangrove to protect these mangrove forests in that regard. So this is where mangrove forests are an adaptation of trees. Wherever there will be moisture and wherever there will be soil, there will be a tendency to grow vegetations. That vegetation grows in a saline zone in the process of mangrove forests. Mangroves are nothing but a certain adaptation of vegetation to salinity of water, tidal forces, and very oxygen deficient water. So there's no reason for the growth. It's a process of what we call as nature's way of adapting itself to the ecotones and the ecosystem. But the idea is this was very systematically destroyed once India wanted to have a standard, you can say, beautiful coastline on which we could have multiple hotels and tourism to happen. So the idea is very simple. The first thing which we learned from this whole process was mangrove forests can allow a better mitigation of tsunamis. Do we understand this point? Mangrove forests are typical to this environment, typical to this ecosystem, and therefore we need to protect them, because tsunami load and tsunami impact can be in a way mitigated by having just a very and it's very diverse also. It is one of the richest, you can say, biodiversity zones along the coast, and therefore what we needed to do was just to protect rather than not do anything else, just to protect our mangroves. So this is an example of how mangrove forests allow for, thank you Atharv for that, allows for mitigation. Perfectly fine. Okay. The second lesson which comes out of it as a corollary, which is an extension of it, was keeping the coastline a public holding and resource. And why does the author says that this is one of the biggest issues? Is because once this actually happened in Thailand and Indonesia, relief and rehabilitation and even the impact became extremely difficult to be ascertained in coastlines which had been now converted into private properties with a lot of resorts. So because it is private property, relief and rehabilitation became very problematic. So he argues, which may be also an overreach, that beaches should mostly remain public property so that the government has full jurisdiction over it, and if such forms of disasters happen, there is no problem of legal, you can say, repercussions of entering it without permission. And therefore the argument was we have to protect our coastline, but also this coastline should be in the jurisdiction of the government, so that the NDRF teams, which is the National Disaster Relief Teams, can actually enter these zones and also mitigate it properly. This is a minor point, but an interesting one, because he gives the example of Thailand. In Thailand, relief became extremely difficult because, as it is, if you will have more and more resorts along the coast, the population along the coast also increases exponentially, which in turn means that if something like this happens, the impact is much higher. And therefore, it's, as I said, a little bit of a stretch point, but an interesting one. Third, he argues that we need to, and this is where the relief aspect comes through, we learned to understand, or rather, we understood that this disaster has two major impacts. One, it creates vulnerabilities, and also the concept of it exposes vulnerabilities. And it's a very interesting point. See, first, it creates a lot of vulnerability, means that if a person was, for example, very well endowed, had a lot of money, was very well placed along the coast in process of livelihood or any other thing, and this is not specific to this disaster, to all disasters, this puts them at risk. Livelihood is gone, their property may be destroyed, their family may be affected, socio-economic, both impacts are there, and this may lead to that person to go under the poverty line, to be in relief and rehabilitation camps. And this creates a new vulnerability, meaning in a way, this hazard and disaster I'll discuss later, don't worry. This in a way creates a new form of vulnerability where these men and women are now not just vulnerable to natural disasters, they are now vulnerable to economic and social pressures also. And the other point which he makes is, it exposes vulnerabilities. What do you mean by exposes vulnerabilities? See, we all know that India is a diverse country. And we also know that India is divided along multiple axes. You have caste, you have gender, you have religion, you have, if caste and varna, same thing if you want to go with that. We have, you can say, socio-economic differences. But caste, religion and gender play a very important role. In deciding our, you can say, identity. Now, during disaster, how relief is given was also based on these axes. Meaning, some communities got better relief, some communities did not get it. And the biggest point was gender discrimination plus vulnerability was something which needed to be studied, which is that women were the most vulnerable in these moments because either they were out of the familial setup, either they did not have livelihood, either they were either widowed or in a way displaced, and if not that, if not that, there was also a moment in which they can be exploited in these moments. Women get affected the most as it is in moments of distress. But disaster-based distress is something which was never talked about previously. So he argued that in the process of relief and rehabilitation, we actually realized that we can create new vulnerabilities, but it can also expose vulnerabilities. And some of the communities 20 years on today still do not have access to basic resources, fresh water, and some of them very well endowed, very good families now are living below the poverty line. This is where this article makes a lot of sense in this moment and gives you a lot to write in the mains examination. Importance of mangrove forests, keeping the coastline public property, and vulnerability being created and being exposed. In that regard, allows us to understand the gendered and the, you can say, caste-based implications of a disaster. This was something which was previously not thought about, which was because local communities are involved. And I'll give you a very simple example of this. If there is a discriminatory system within a certain local community along the coast, during disaster, do you expect these people to transcend these, you can say, caste barriers, gendered barriers, or the concept of these forms of purity and pollution in that regard? Do you expect that? That people will forget? And this is where it's a complicated answer, but mostly no. That is where community-based relief, because the first responders are mostly the local community, the sensitization of these local communities vis-a-vis discrimination and gender-based discrimination is something which was equally important. And that is where once this disaster happened, in every school curriculum, now we had disaster management as a specific subject. And disaster management, thereafter UPSC also became extremely cognizant of it, and after 2013 introduced it within GS paper 3. The idea was that disaster relief, mitigation and risk detection now became the new vocabulary of the government and also of the people. So the risk has to be reduced, but it will happen because these are supernatural events or natural events which cannot be, in a way, earthquake cannot be avoided, cannot be mitigated when it is happening. But what can be mitigated is the effect. So when we cannot do anything about the cause, we can at least take away the vulnerability after that cause happens. So therefore, we'll talk about the act just in the next 5 minutes. But I hope that you understand what are the 4 major points he's trying to argue, the lessons we learned from the process of the 2004 disaster, which happened today, 20 years back. Yes. So what type of question do we expect? This is the type of question we expect in the examination. The 2004 tsunami fundamentally changed our understanding of this disaster. What are the key lessons to be learned from it? Very well, you can say, structured question. Needs both the event understanding, also how and what we learned out of that event itself. So yes, we'll talk about Disaster Management Act 2005 in the next 1 minute. But I hope everybody is on the same page with me with regards to this. In the introduction, talk about the moment, what happened in 2004. In the body, talk about how tsunamis are now being studied. I'll give you more fodder for that in the 3rd article. And the key lesson to be learned, you can talk about these 4 points. Rather than making vague points, you have concrete 4 points. Vulnerability, the concept of mangroves, the concept of public property along coastlines, and last but not the least, the concept of relief, exposing and creating more vulnerability, specifically gender. Okay. With this, we transition to the 2nd article. Now, the 2nd article has been written in the context of a recent amendment which came to the Disaster Management Act. The DMA Act was introduced in 2005 and has recently been amended in 2024. Now, the 2005 Act is something which actually really doesn't make sense if we do it in detail right now. Rather, the amendment becomes important and what are the issues which have come through in that regard. Sandhya, if that will be the case, if there are, we'll try to do that. Don't worry about that. So let's talk about the Disaster Management Bill 2024, and there are multiple points which she's made, and there are very valid points also. Before I go into the details, I'll give you the larger points first, and then we'll go into the details. First thing is that this is considered to be a problematic amendment because governance, accountability, and efficiency of this act has been impacted. If we'll go into a little bit more of detail, you will realize that that is also the case. The first point which he says is that this 2024 amendment, the first issue is related to semantics. Semantics means how do you define something? What is the words which you are using? Word-based understanding. Now she says that the bill does not talk about the local communities itself. It has what is called as a top-down perspective. Top-down perspective, which is most of the action is being considered by monitoring and guidelines which the state gives, rather than using the words supervision and direction, in which local governments, communities, and local people were made a part of it. This is where she says, if you look at the international framework, the Yokohama strategy, the Yogo framework of action, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, one of the most important legislation, or you can say piece of information and literature available for disaster risk reduction, it always says that the first responders are the local communities. Somehow there is a omission of the word local communities, and this is where there's a top-down approach. That disaster relief will always be top to down. Rather than creating first responders within the local community, you want it to be a state-driven process, which is problematic. Because an NDRF team will only reach after hours, but relief starts from every minute after the relief itself, or after the disaster itself. Once the disaster is over, then every minute counts. It could save countless of lives. And therein, a top-down approach actually makes no sense whatsoever. Because thereafter, you are waiting for another disaster to happen, which is the concept of how you are exposing people to new forms of vulnerability. So the first argument she argues is that there's an approach is incorrect. The 2005 Act in a way had a better approach because it talked about local communities also, it talked about supervision and direction given by the people. Now it is saying, we will give you guidelines, we will create the monitoring. It's not that the state has no role, but the local community and the state have to work together in order to create frameworks which can be understood by everyone, but also it can be implemented by you and me on the ground. The second aspect is where she again says that while the bill defines hazard, resilience, and vulnerability, it does not talk about the role of local communities, panchayats, wards, NGOs in disaster management. Just to give you an understanding, the difference between a hazard and a disaster is, this is what is called a dangerous situation, the vulnerability which is to human life. Disaster is the event which changes the whole moment. A hazard can become a disaster. A disaster is a form of hazard which has taken you can say it's now manifested itself. So you can mitigate hazards, disasters, thereafter you need relief and rehabilitation. So it is less critical consequences, bigger critical consequence, and this could lead to a series of events which would become a disaster. So hazards was very well defined within this whole concept. Yeah, very good point, Sheikh, which is building houses on the coastline is a hazard. Tsunami is a disaster. But because the hazard created more vulnerability, the disaster scale was much bigger. Very good point. In a way, mangroves reduce the hazard or reduce the disaster. What do they reduce? Mangroves can be farmed, SK. Mangroves can be farmed. if there's a constant effect, we are actually reforesting the mangrove forest. Mangroves reduce the disaster impact, and they also at the same point of time reduce the hazard. But the word which will be used is hazard, which is the vulnerability is reduced, disaster will happen either way. So the idea is mangroves are very good in mitigating the hazards related to being on the coastline. You are using the word disaster in post facto. Once it has been done. I am saying pre facto, which is before it has happened. So today, it's not that a tsunami is going to come every minute. If today there's a mangrove forest today, as of right now, it reduces the hazard and the risk. It reduces the risk of the, you can say, vulnerabilities which come through the disaster. So if you are saying disaster, you are post facto. But as a moment at that given point of time, they're reducing the hazard. Get my point? The vulnerability is in turn going to lead to disaster. Perfect. Great. Now, these 2 points, I'll bring in everything together, but these 2 points are very substantial, which is it does not talk about the right approach, but it also does not talk about the local communities. This is the first point which he makes, which is there's an absence of local communities in it, which is very problematic because local communities are the ones who will reduce the vulnerabilities and who are the first responders. But then she talks about something even more interesting, which is that when it comes to vulnerability management, which is called intersectional discrimination, for example, for women, disabled, lower castes, the LGBTQIA community, plus community, these discriminations are at several layers, meaning it could be that a woman faces as a disabled, as a lower caste, and maybe as an LGBTQI plus community, she can have intersectional discrimination, meaning maybe she's not been discriminated as a woman, but she's been discriminated as a disabled person. Or she's been discriminated as a lower caste, but not as a disabled, not as a woman. She may be also discriminated along the lines of LGBTQ plus community, but she may not be discriminated as a lower caste. So this is called intersectional discrimination, which is there are so many discrimination layers that in turn, the whole act does not talk about how does discrimination and vulnerability of these vulnerable sections get mitigated, meaning there's a silence. There's a silence about intersectional discrimination. It talks about relief and rehabilitation, but it does not talk about how it will be impacted or it will impact these sections. So though it says it's an inclusive and holistic approach, the bill actually has nothing related to inclusiveness related to it. And this is where the third, or rather the fourth point comes in, which is the performance of a certain body is not taken into account. Which is, for example, there's a disaster which happened. It may have been a storm surge, which because of the cyclone, there was a lot of flooding in a certain area. There was a framework under which relief and rehabilitation should have been given. However, the authorities failed to be prepared for that disaster and may also have responded in the worst way possible. Now you tell me, shouldn't that body or that authority be evaluated for its response and then either reprimanded or changed? If storm surge is 1% of what happens in a tsunami and they were not able to predict it with all technology available, not able to inform people, not able to help the people, not able to manage the disaster itself, shouldn't there be an accountability and a structure in which these men and women should be held accountable for their actions? Again, the bill does not talk about anything like that, which is it does not create a performance evaluation. Therefore, there is no accountability on anyone. So there is a moment in which you really don't care as a local authority if you actually are following the protocols or not. Because you cannot be prosecuted for them. You cannot be, in a way, reprimanded for them. And this is where she again talks about a very interesting case wherein accountability is not fixed, not at the local level, at the authority level, but nowhere. So section 12 and 13 of the DMA, which used to talk about minimum standards of relief, meaning if I am a disastrous tsunami, I should have food, I should have fresh water, I should have a place to stay, shelter. I should have, for example, if my livelihood was a fisherman, I should be given a boat later, maybe through the process of some form of funding. Maybe there was a need for loan repayment after the relief itself. Some form of relief is minimum. That now line has been omitted. Interestingly. So there is no minimum standard of relief which is expected under the DMA Act 2024, which is problematic. That now the state government's minimum standard of relief has fully been dropped under 12, 13 and 19 of the Act. So the section now impacts even bigger vulnerable sections, because now widows, orphans, homeless and any form of assistance which happens after it, there is no section to say what is the basic obligation of the state. So the basic minimum obligation of the state is now not talked about, which is even more problematic if you actually think of it. Now this means that if there's a disaster which happens, I just give you a bottle of water and one cup of Maggi plus a space in which there is no toilets and there is no, for example, fresh water resource, and when it rains, it pours like anything. You are more vulnerable to dengue, malaria and cholera. But who do you go to? There is no provision within the Act. The state is going to say, I am doing the minimum. But that minimum level is not defined only. This is where accountability has been removed from the state, which is not a good thing. See, the relief which you do is not a favor to the people. This is a very bad tendency we develop as humans. You are, as it is in India and in the world nowadays, we make disaster relief a business. As soon as something like this will happen, thousands of trusts will now start to ask for tsunami relief money, which they will mostly misappropriate. Some are good, but it's not that everybody is actually holier than thou and everybody is doing the good work. People will misappropriate, launder that money, not even give it to the people. That is why we say that you should actually give the state money rather than giving these private bodies money. But more than that, now the state is also not obligated to do the minimum for the people. This is where the author has been extremely critical of this Act. That she argues that if we do not have the concept of minimum obligation of the state defined within the Act itself, then what is the whole point of the Act? Because when it will come to state governments, in these moments, they will have issues of funds. So they will inaugurate multiple 1,000 crore based wasteful projects. But when it will come to bringing back their people to a basic standard of living, then they will start to say to the center, give us money, to the private sector, give us money. So let's understand one thing, it is the state's obligation, it is the state's basic DPSP to help the people in this moment. It is not that they are doing a favor to the people. So please do understand this point, that this dilution of the DMA Act is problematic. Now obviously you can't write so many of these points in the examination. So let me summarize it. Can I summarize all of these into 4 basic points on which she is actually trying to give us problems related to the DMA Act? Can I do that? Infrastructure be developed in coastline where Sheikh, we can make better houses, and that could be something which would be part of risk management. Meaning we could use building materials which are more resilient to pressure and force. That was part of the disaster relief process itself. That is called risk management. Okay. So what are the problems? Let's try to bring them all on the same sheet. First point, you have semantics issue. Semantics issue means that the definition plus the omission of local communities within this framework is problematic, wherein local communities in a way are the most important first responders, and therefore their empowerment and a town up approach is needed, where you decentralize the points to the local communities. Now, that does not change, Peter. That is the basic static that Chetan sir would cover with you in disaster management classes. That does not change. That is where there is a whole list. That is not the point we're discussing here. That is pure disaster management if you want to go about it. There are any positive points? No. As of right now, UPSC, no. Mostly dilution and omissions. Second, the role of panchayats, local bodies, NGOs needs to be defined. Needs to be defined. Third point is intersectional discrimination needs to be acknowledged, but at the same point of time, it also needs to be dealt with, because there is nothing about this in the whole act itself. Fourth is accountability, which is minimum standard of relief, performance, evaluation, and further, this is a very big dilution which is happening. This is the biggest issue as of right now in this act, that the accountability aspect has been removed. She further makes two more points which may be considered peripheral but are important. There is nothing related to animals, meaning thousands of animals die in this whole process, and we have no way how to mitigate disaster relief for animals, be it cattle, be it drought animals, be it basic flora and fauna of that sector, specifically the fauna. So there is no mention of animal and animal relief, because some of these people are based on these animals. Their livelihood is quite important. And she makes one more peripheral point, which is international cooperation should also have been introduced as a section, which is if something happens in the Bay of Bengal sector, or in the Arabian Sea sector, or in the ASEAN countries, be it BIMSTEC, be it ASEAN, be it BBIN, be it any form of multilateral understanding, be it the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which is IORA. The idea was there should have been a little bit of a understanding that international cooperation and relief is equally important. But if you're able to write the first 4 points, you will be able to write an answer for something like this. There are systemic gaps within the Disaster Management Amendment Bill 2024. Do you agree? So this is a question where you would have to bring in these points, which is the issue of semantics, which is definitions, issue of local bodies being omitted, down-up approach, the issue of intersectional discrimination being not talked about, and the issue of accountability. If we understand this, I'll move to the third topic, which is again related to tsunamis, but now related to science and technology. These two are more about governance and disaster management. The next one is related to science and technology. Can we talk about that? Everybody's on the same page with me, right? Atharva, the point is they get impacted. The heaven aspect is different. It's about impact. Livestock and animals equally get impacted by disaster. And there has to be an understanding for that also. Okay. Now we move to the third one. And this is related to, this is out of the science section of the newspaper. And this is basically an S&T, science and technology based understanding. Government hurry in relief to foreign countries, why not us? Shiva Kumar, that is a politically charged question. That is where, when it comes on yourself, you are more calculated in response. Giving money to foreign countries during their disaster is the easiest thing which you can do. So it is more a calculated and a more systemic approach which needs to be taken. So giving relief to someone else is always easier. That is how giving, as you say, any form of lesson to someone else is always easy. Using it on yourself is more difficult. So based on the same basic human principle, we will be very quick to say that you are wrong, but we will never accept that we are wrong itself. Standard. That's not because of certain, it's a politically charged question also, but it's a basic human nature based understanding that we are quick to respond to others because there's no stake for us. When it's about yourself, you will be more calculated. Okay. Now, since 2004, there have been multiple strides in the process of what we call as tsunami relief, tsunami early warning, and tsunami as a, you can say, even in the concept of understanding earthquakes, plate tectonics, and generally the complex in which it happens, which is volcanoes, tsunamis, and the early warning systems all work together. The idea is that science and technology based, you can say, interventions have become very important. In 2024, today, we are very, 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 you can say, efficient in identifying, very quick to respond to tsunamis across the earth, which was not the case in 2004. And there's a reason for that. I will discuss it within this article. But the first and foremost point which this article makes is that 2004 highlighted the vulnerability of the world to this natural disaster. And herein lies a very important point, which is that because it was such an unexpected moment in human history, now we have learnt a lot in the process of understanding paleo tsunamis, which is tsunamis which happened through our history itself, and also how to respond it. But this article talks about a very important body which exists today, which is called the Indian Tsunami Early Warning Center, which is the ITEWC. This was created in 2007 by the Union Ministry of Earth Sciences, an important point, and the Government of India thereafter created a very interesting framework, within which today we have a very robust system of early warning detection. And this is where there's a lot of interesting details which are given about this body. So the Indian National Center for Ocean Information Services, INCOIS, at Hyderabad, where this early warning system operates from, has seismological stations, which is, it studies the earthquake activities, and it also studies the pressures at the bottom level itself, which is when there is a tsunami or when there is any form of pressure differences or seismic activity which happens within the ocean itself, these early warning systems come into perspective. So as of right now, as of today, 24/7 tidal stations, pressure recorders, and seismological, you can say, stations are recording most of the data to predict a tsunami. And these systems can transmit offshore and deep ocean tsunami observations within minutes to the ground stations, and there are 350 such global stations which now are connected through the IMD also. Today, in real time, within 10 minutes, a system can identify a potential tsunami, thereafter issue a tsunami alert and warning, and thereafter, depending on the severity, also intimate the countries on where it is going to be, in a way, culminating in tsunamis. This is something which was needed in 2004 but was not in place. This is how we as an international community, as a global community, have responded. That within 10 minutes, everybody's phone is going to have an alert in that station, in that sector, in that country that a tsunami is coming. And what is more interesting is, India is the fifth country, only the fifth country after the US, Japan, Chile and Australia to have an advanced early warning system. And this is where you have to understand that today we are much better prepared and risk is now lower. This is the strides which have happened in the science sector. But this is what is related to the science aspect, which is the technological aspect which developed. Here, there is a very interesting concept which has come through, which is called paleo tsunami studies or tsunami geology. This is a very important point. Please, you can expect this as a term in the examination. See, tsunamis have a very big impact, meaning it can change the landform. It can change the geology. It can change the land relief of any coast in that regard. Now, if tsunamis at a 9.1 Richter scale earthquake would have happened previously, there would have been similar disastrous, you can say, consequences. If that is the case, can we not study the archaeology of an area or the geology of an area to understand how many such events have happened previously? This was never a part of our understanding previously. But if you actually understand it, there is a marked difference. And this is what now the US and India are trying to cooperate over. Close to 3.5 meter differences in the landscape can come through because of tsunamis. And a very interesting point which came through was, by studying the geology of the coastline along which the 2004 tsunami happened, it turns out a similar event happened during the Pallava period. Because in a certain layer, there were mangrove forests destruction within a very small time scale captured, which basically showed that during the Pallavan period, which is basically your 8th, 9th, 10th century CE, before Delhi Sultanate period, there was a major disaster which happened in this coast, and most of the forests got buried under the soil because of that paleo tsunami in that regard. This is a very important point you need to understand, which is that over a period of time, we are now studying that was this a one-off event? Are we vulnerable to these events more than what we know? And if yes, how or the way the earth shows us certain indications about these events previously and can give us a certain understanding on the magnitude is now studied under tsunami geology. So I hope now tsunami geology and paleo tsunami studies is something which you will understand. There is a more vulnerability on the eastern coast because it is near the ring of fire. If western coast is more immune to it, it can happen in the western coast also, because earthquakes can happen in either sectors, but because there's a divergent plate in the eastern sector, in the western sector, and a convergent plate in the eastern sector, there's a bigger vulnerability on the east coast. And that Sumatran Sunda Trench itself is a place where seismic activities is known for. So therefore, the idea is very simple. Today, we are much better prepared, but today we are also, yes, why not UPSC? We are better prepared to respond and understand tsunamis. This is where you now need to also know some of the ways the early warning systems work. And one of the most important tools which we use today as a way of understanding. So I hope that the first part of the lecture is sorted, this part, which is the institution and what is called as tsunami geology, because then I'll give you at least 4 to 5 different systems which are used today for what we call as early tsunami detection. First part is fine. How does the Pallavan period show us the paleo tsunami aspect and tsunami geology? Yes, sir. Okay. So DART and DART 1 and 2 is based on what is called as a tsunameter, and what this studies is pressure. This is one of the most advanced systems and one of the most, you can say, interesting systems which was developed after 2004, wherein through a buoyant, it studies the pressure differences which happen because of tsunamis. And this is considered to be the quickest way today through which, if there is any seismic activity, this DART 1 and DART 2 are able to identify changing pressures at the ocean, you can say floor bed, and further within the ocean itself, and therefore inform through satellite communication the ground stations that there's a tsunami coming. But this is not the only way. If you look at the different, you can say, systems which we use today, we have a pressure gauge, we have long-term seismometers, which is study even small differences and changes along convergent and divergent places. We have autonomous, what we call as unmanned vehicles also, which go around studying pressure and change in the, you can say, topography of the ocean bed. We have what is called a geodetic transponder. Geodetic transponder is the exact same concept as a pressure difference, but it basically checks the difference in topography. So a geodetic transponder checks if there is a change in the topography of the ocean because of convergence or divergence. So if there's a certain, you can say, high vulnerability because of geodetic changes, it informs the ground stations. And we already have the DART system together with even wave glides, which is these glides can check what is the standard wavelength of a, you can say, certain ocean or sea. If there's a very big change in the wave, it can then inform through satellite to the ground station that there is some major changes which have been brought in the surface waves, which in turn can transform into and become tsunamis. So if you actually realize, today we are very, very well prepared for tsunamis. But for that, 220,000 people had to get, in a way, killed in the process of 2004 tsunami, and 1.7 million people till today are struggling because of it. But for the purpose of the examination, the science and knowledge of tsunamis since 2004 has grown exponentially. Comment. This is where you would have to talk about the geodetic transponder, the concept of DART, you would have talked about pressure gauges, to talk about the wave gliders, and how we are now also studying paleo, which is events which had happened previously in the past, to also predict them in the future. So are we sorted with tsunami now? Because these were 3 articles together, which together give us a lot of knowledge about tsunamis and the concept of how do we respond to it. The lesson being learned, the act itself, and the science behind it. So quite comprehensive discussion I've had, because this will now become something as a question in mains or prelims for sure. So I hope now you are capable of understanding the static, the current affairs, the changes which are happening, the legal changes and the legislative changes. I want everybody's yes here. The point is to be as comprehensive as possible, and I hope that this is good enough for your understanding. Okay, with this, now we change the topic and we go take a small detour to Australia to understand very minor point, which is called the Online Safety Amendment in the rules and regulations related to Australia. In Australia, recently, they have introduced an online safety amendment, social media minimum age bill. Don't have to learn it, obviously. But why is it important? Because it creates a precedence. And the bill, the basic concept is that it asks social media platforms to have reasonable steps and safeguards to prevent children under the age of 16 to have an account on their platform. Meaning, what is used is called age-restricted social media platforms, which may include TikTok, Facebook, Snapchat, Reddit, Instagram, Twitter, or X. On this, anybody who is less than 16 years of age should not be able to create a account. This is the basic idea here. The idea is that you need to be, as a service provider, be able to put in steps through which you are able to determine the age of a person who is making the account on your platform. If she is or he is an Australian citizen and she is less than or he is less than 16 years of age, then there should be no way they should be able to make an account. Now they say that if that is not created as a structure, $49.5 million is the penalty which will be pushed in. However, they do not define what does reasonable steps mean, and an e-safety commissioner is being appointed in Australia to check if these platforms are doing enough or not. The idea is, if a parent creates an account and then gives access to a 16-year-old, then that is okay, meaning it does not prohibit using the platform via parental control. It prohibits a 16-year-old to have an autonomous account. Now, this has two issues. First, how do you check the age of a person? We've all done it. If it says less than 16 years, if it says you are not allowed to do it 16 years, they'll just put in the wrong date of birth. They'll increase the date of birth. So the idea is, if I am a adolescent, if I'm extremely desperate to be on Instagram, I will find a way to just change the data. Now, the argument would be, for example, if this happens in India, link Aadhaar with Instagram account. Maybe that is a solution, but that is even more problematic. Why should I give Instagram access to my biometric data, my demographic data? Why should I allow now social media platforms to have data and access to the Aadhaar system or any other system across the world? So this looks like a basic lip service to this concept, because there is no way you can actually implement it on the ground. You really can't, because either it will lead to data breaches, privacy issues, or it will be so superficial that it will be more or less useless in that regard. The idea is, controlling adolescents' access to social media is important, because recently there have been multiple studies that it impacts the mental health, it impacts the basic understanding of people. Children are now developing multiple forms of, you can say, tendencies which are based, be it aggressive tendencies, be it depressing tendencies, all because of social media. They are now open to multiple forms of predators also. Children are vulnerable to multiple forms of vulnerability on the social media platform. They are watching content which they shouldn't. So yes, stopping adolescents from entering into social media platforms at an age where they cannot understand the content itself is fine. But this is not the solution, because firstly, most people will get access. It's very easy for a child to forge the parents' data also, because the mother's Aadhaar card or anything is lying around, they will do it. If they have a will, they will have a way. So therefore, this act, now people are arguing in Australia, is firstly too dangerous for privacy, because it will lead to social media platforms getting access to data which they shouldn't. And more than that, even if they do, then do we really have a structure in which a social media platform can collect that data, keep it securely, destroy it later, and prevent people from entering into these platforms itself? This is the problem here, that we are giving too much responsibility to the social media platform to basically cut its own subscriber base. So therefore, this is where we have given the lion the responsibility to take care of the deer. So why would a social media platform want to cut its base when these adolescents are actually the biggest important, you can say, demography which they try to target itself? Because a 35-year-old or 40-year-old is not going to become a Instagram influencer. It is this age that they basically try to catch them early. And this is where this bill, it's just creating a precedent, but it is not the right solution. Now, what do you do with this information? It's for Australia, not for us. Social media is one of the most important threats to adolescent population of the world. Discuss. Now, in this, there can be a conclusion or an introduction where you either talk about the current affairs aspect, that recently Australia introduced a bill, or you can end by saying that Australia introduced a bill which tried to curb it, but the problems of privacy and data information comes through. So in both ways, the body is going to be on what you understand by social media, how does it impact you and me, but in the introduction or conclusion, you can use this data, right? So I hope that you understand why am I covering this concept, because it's basically giving us a good insight into the larger perspective related to social media and how do we tackle it. Can I move to the next one? Two articles together, important. Ken-Betwa project, now finally foundation stone has been laid. So let's try to understand that. Can we move to that topic? Yes, Bhumika, that is also true. Okay. Now finally, after 4 years, the Ken-Betwa river linkage project foundation stone has been laid. Now the question is, what is this project? What is the larger project under which it is happening? And what are the issues related to it? And why was there a delay of 4 years? Now see, India has a very unique geography, and at any given point of time during the monsoon season or just post monsoon, there are two types of disasters which happen at the same point of time in India. There will be multiple states which are flooded underwater, and there will be multiple states in India which will be reeling under drought. And I think we've seen this, that in Maharashtra, from Delhi, water is going in trains. And for example, Chennai or in Tamil Nadu, the city is underwater because of storm surges or because of any form of what we call as monsoonal rain, which happens, what we call as the retreating monsoon. Or at a given point of time, there's flooding in North India and there is drought in South India or peninsular sector. So we have these type of situations coming up because of extreme weather events happening because of climate change. Global warming has its own way of manifesting itself. Now, under this, Bundelkhand was a very problematic sector which has reeled because of lack of water for now close to decades. Water is a very scarce resource in this sector. And therein, there was a project which was introduced, which is called the National River Linking Project, formerly known as the National Perspective Plan, under which transfer of water from surplus basin to deficit basins was thought about. Meaning that in some part of India, there is too much water or volume in the rivers, and in some part of India, the volume is extremely low. So 30 such projects were identified wherein if in the peninsular concept and in the Himalayan component, if we link certain rivers, it would solve the issue of flooding and drought at the same given point of time. So 16 in the peninsular sector, 14 in the Himalayan sector were identified as river linking projects, which would allow for this issue to go away. Now, outrightly, one of the biggest issues in this was that you can't have something like this because it affects the ecology and the biodiversity of the rivers. Meaning, there could be a specific biodiversity in a specific river. If you give access to another river via a canal, then biodiversity can migrate, and there is something called invasive species. A species can thereafter dominate and maybe change the whole ecosystem and the whole biodiversity of that sector. So this itself has a lot of issues related to what we call as invasive species invasion, and in turn leading to either what we call as homogeneity across the whole sector, or even leading to biodiversity destruction. So this has a problem. You can't just link rivers because all rivers are not the same, and there are different types of species which are involved with different rivers in that regard. So let's be very, very clear. This project basically is based on a utilitarian aspect that, okay, this deficit surplus, let's link, but does not take into account the severity of biodiversity and ecosystems. That's a separate issue altogether. Now, in this, for a very long time, Ken-Betwa was considered to be the most viable out of the whole project itself. Out of these 30 projects, Ken-Betwa was considered to be the best. Now, Ken-Betwa, what we call as the tributaries of the Yamuna River, one starting from the Uttar Pradesh sector, both basically originating from the Uttar Pradesh sector as tributaries, entering into Madhya Pradesh. But Ken was the one which actually had surplus of water, and Betwa was the one which had deficit of water. But if you link these two projects to two rivers together, it goes across the Bundelkhand sector of MP. So it's a UP-MP based project. But this red link which you see here allows for fresh water resources and irrigation channels to go into areas which previously had a major deficit. Now, this is where the problem starts. This is where the problem starts. This whole project is based on MP-UP. It is based on certain districts of UP, certain districts of MP. A dam called the Dhaudhan Dam would be constructed in MP, and the problem is its location. It would be constructed within the Panna Tiger Reserve. It would then create a canal from which the Dhaudhan Dam water would be redirected towards Betwa, and thereafter it would produce 103 megawatts plus also give fresh water to areas which previously have not seen water. And this is what the Prime Minister has now laid the foundation for. 45,000 crores is the amount of money which will be invested. Now, the problem lies in how it is being constructed. That is where, good, very good, give water resources, and there is a need for irrigation channels. But this will lead to inundation in the Panna Tiger Reserve, which is a lot of the reserve will go underwater. Further, it is believed that 23 lakh trees will be cut to create this dam and also redirect the water to Betwa. And this is where the environmentalists, opposition doesn't really matter. They are opposing it because they are the only ones who proposed it. It's all politics. But environmentalists and the people who are associated with this are arguing this could lead to this whole tiger reserve becoming redundant. It will become redundant because too much of it will go underwater, and thereafter with so much habitat destruction, this will cease to remain a tiger reserve. And therefore, the problem is that with 10% of the tiger reserve in a way being inundated or being deforested, is it really worth it? And this brings in the larger concept which has always been there, which we have talked about, the Great Nicobar, what we call as multimodal port, which is also developing in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. That is the ecological cost of this project worth the power which will be generated and the people who will get the benefits of it? Is it worth the cost? Is it worth the habitat destruction? And is it worth the whole concept itself? This is where we are now back to that perennial question, that is ecological cost and environmental advantages, or rather economical advantages, how do we balance it? The environmental impact assessment has been done. There was a very negative, you can say, report which came for the Ken-Betwa link, but it's still happening. This politics is also there, but it is still happening. Here it is believed it is not worth it, but still they are going through. And Great Nicobar is also being said that as it will fully impact the whole ecology of this sector, but still it is going through. See, for you, the basic facts are good enough for prelims examination, but the main aspect here of environmental costs and economic costs, environmental costs and economic benefits is problematic. And this is where the government has already given a go-ahead, and you also have to fundamentally check that do these projects actually make sense? Yes, this is the dilemma of growth, this is the dilemma of development. This is where we all have to understand that there's no right and wrong answer here. But you have to, in the examination, pay a lot of attention to the smaller points here. Because you cannot outrightly say that Ken-Betwa is useless, because there are a lot of people who will actually gain out of it. You can also at the same point of time not say that this project does not have any impact on the environment. You have to take a middling path, and the middling path is going to be, as one of you said, environmental impact assessment. We can do a social audit also. We can actually see the long-term vision. One point which you can use is politics should be kept outside these projects, because political gains out of something like this will have short-term gains for someone, but in turn will lead to environmental destruction in the long run. So you can talk about this in two aspects. Always take a middling path, cannot redundant as it is the foundation stone has been pushed in, cannot say it is useless, but it can also in a way have an impact. How do we mitigate the destruction of Panna Tiger Reserve is something which has to be understood. Do we create another tiger reserve? Do we have what is called as Campa, which is afforestation happening in the same sector? There's an issue with compensatory afforestation also in India, because it doesn't stipulate where that afforestation needs to be done, where the trees have to be replanted. Meaning you could destroy a tropical green forest and thereafter you could put trees in the desert. So Campa also has to change and account for something like this. That was a little bit of a complicated topic, but I hope now you understand the problems related to it, and it brings us to the perennial issue of how does India manage an issue like this, which is we have to grow. We can't stop our growth because of environmental reasons, but how do we balance our environmental cost and economic development is a question to be understood in the long run. This leads us to the last topic. One minor point I will make. I've already discussed all of these topics in quite comprehensive manner. The last point is Saudi Arabia and India are looking for a defense venture. Both these nations are looking to become exporters of arms rather than importers of arms. And both these nations are looking for what we call as today indigenization, which is producing ammunition within their own country. This is where recently the envoy from Saudi Arabia has said that India and Saudi Arabia are aligned in this vision, and the partnership between these two in defense sector and cooperation would be a game changer. Nothing concrete is given in this article, but this minor point of how both have the same vision and therefore there is cooperation. Now, before I end this session, let me summarize everything for you, because 5 heavy topics we've discussed. One is, what is a tsunami? We discussed that. Why do tsunamis happen? Subduction, divergent plate, the ring of fire. We discussed the 2004 event itself, its impact. Then we discussed lesson to be learned. Lessons were very simple. Mangroves are important, public resources, the concept of disaster relief, discrimination, and gender discrimination. Then we saw the recent changes which have happened in the NDMA Act, which has removed the accountability, has led to semantical issues. The approach itself is problematic, which is top down, should be down up, and the role of the local community has not been taken into account. Then we understood, okay, this in turn leads to us to understand that how in the larger perspective of things, science of tsunamis has changed. So we now understand tsunamis better. We have early warning systems, we have the DART system, we have what we call as systems which understand the pressure and also the geological changes which are happening. We have paleogeology also, intersectional discrimination also a very important word which we discussed. And thereafter we moved to Australia, an attempt to stop adolescents from moving to social media, not effected on paper also. Further, we have understood Ken-Betwa. The linking of these two tributaries of the Yamuna will impact UP and MP. Problems is the ecological cost at the Panna Tiger Reserve going underwater. So I hope that all of this, along with the fact that India and Saudi Arabia are now going to have defense partnership, was what we had to discuss. One question Shri had asked me. I'm going to answer that again. Thank you so much. I hope all of this made sense. We were discussing about lateral entry. Shri, any specific question you have related to that? Is lateral entry affecting foreign services too? As of right now, lateral entry, most of the, you can say, vacancies have been pushed into only the IAS. There is no bar from pushing it into the Indian Forest Service, Indian Forest, Foreign or Indian Police Services. But it is at the joint secretary level where it has been actually argued. A lot of you also said that, see, the ranking system which I gave in the last video was just hypothetical. I know that additional secretary is over joint secretary. It was just the impulsive moment I've created a certain structure. But that 33% data is correct, which is only 33% of joint secretaries are IS officers. But yes, Shri, it can impact foreign services. It is on the will of the DOPT and the will of the government itself. Fully on the will of the government. Rahul, I will try to bring in World War II soon. Maybe early next year, January 1st or 2nd week, 3rd week, I'll try to figure out. Second World War video will come through for sure in one shot video. If you have ever considered us as a partner in your preparation, use the code IAS English to join so that you can also get mentorship sessions from us. The UCSC is happening on 29th, 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. Please do use it to evaluate your preparation or join our family with 90% scholarship or other exciting prizes. And last but not the least, the PDF of this session will be available in the QR code based Telegram group which I've given you in the beginning. So I'll see you tomorrow with another set of issues. Thank you, take care, and bye-bye.